We came down here to Jack London Square because Jack London, of course, is Oakland's most famous writer. I'm Oakland's most unfamous writer. And this saloon here is called the First and Last Chance, or Jack London's Rendezvous. Jack London was born in 1876 in San Francisco, but he spent most of his life right here in Oakland. And he used to go in this saloon when he was 15 and do some of his first writing, sit at a table there and write. His most famous writing was adventure stories and dog stories, Tales of the Yukon. But Jack London also was a very astute social critic. He lived most of his early life in lower class areas here in Oakland, and he'd look up at the hills and see the rich people who were born with land and beautiful homes and money and the assurance they'd never go hungry, and so he became very aware of social and economic problems. And some of his best writing was about the economic struggle. Stories like The Dream of Debs, about how the workers had a general strike and take over the industries and run them democratically for the good of all the people in the world. And his book about the London slums, People of the Abyss, and his novel, The Iron Heel, in which he amazingly prophesies a future fascist uprising, which in his novel occurred in the early 30s, at almost exactly the same time that Hitler came to power in Germany. Amazingly prophetic book. Over here is a cabin Jack London lived in the Yukon. This is the cabin Jack London stayed in the winter of 1897 when he went north to the Yukon to join the gold rush. He didn't find any gold there, but he did get material for some of his greatest stories. He wrote dozens and dozens of stories based on his experiences up in the Yukon. I wanted to tell an amusing little anecdote about Jack London and the First and Last Chance. In the early 70s, I had a novel about Mexican farm workers published. It was called The Bracero. The title Bracero is from the Spanish word brazo, arm. It means people who work with their arms. And this novel was published in Moscow in the former Soviet Union in 1979. And by then I had met Jack London's daughter, Joan London, and her son, Bart Abbott. And when I was about ready to leave for the Soviet Union, Bart Abbott put me in touch with the #1 expert on Jack London in the Soviet Union, Vil Bykov, who had been over here a couple of times to talk to him and his mother. Vil Bykov was writing a biography of Jack London in Russian, and he asked my help on something. He showed me a little placard, which he said was on the wall here in the First and Last Chance. And what it said was, "All nations welcome except," and then I couldn't make out the last word. Apparently it had been copied incorrectly, and he asked me if when I got back to Oakland I'd go check on that and let him know what this meant. So a couple of days after I got back to Oakland, I went in the First and Last Chance over here, and sure enough, this little placard was on the wall behind the bar, and what it says is, "All nations welcome except Carrie." Of course, Carrie Nation was the woman who went all over the country breaking up whiskey kegs, she and her followers, and closing up saloons, so they didn't think so much of Carrie Nation.
How did you become a writer?
Well, one reason is that I was inspired by one of Jack London's novels, Martin Eden, his most autobiographical novel about his struggles to become a writer, and aside from that, I'm not sure I know all the reasons myself. I think I first got a sense of creativity when I was 5 years old. I lived on my grandmother's farm in near a little town called Manteca, about 70 miles east of here. And I planted my first garden at the age of 5, and it was such a thrill to see these plants coming up, something I'd helped created myself. And ever since then, I've had this desire to create, and seeing those plants come up is sort of like looking at a blank sheet of paper and thinking of all the possibilities for creating something beautiful and important on that sheet of paper. And also I think I was motivated by the desire to communicate. When you see things that really impress you, the beauty of nature or remarkable people, you have a desire to communicate these things to other people. So that's another motive. And of course, I hope to make a living. Other writers who inspired me to write were in my junior year in high school in Tracy, a town about 60 miles east of here, in American literature. When I first read the stories and poems of Edgar Allan Poe, that stimulated me somewhat. And then when we came to Walt Whitman, my mind was really inflamed by this fantastic poetry of Whitman. I began writing reams of Whitman-esque poetry. And later, when I was about 18, I discovered the poetry of Percy Bysshe Shelley. And this really excited and stimulated me to write, too. And of course, Shelley, like Jack London, was a great social activist and idealist. And I had hoped, of course, to make my living as a writer. And well, at first, after I started writing poetry, I planned to become a wandering poet, but I gradually realized poets in the United States, at least, hardly make any money at all. And also, it's too cold much of the year to sleep out in the open, so I decided to start writing novels and short stories. And partly because of being inspired by Jack London's Martin Eden, I wrote my first novel when I was 19. And later I worked on a fishing boat out of Los Angeles Harbor. We went way down off the coast of Mexico. And I wrote an 80-page novelette based on this experience, which was published in 12 installments in a small magazine. This is how I took my first hobo and railroad trip when I was 17 years old, right after I got out of high school in Tracy, a little town about 60 miles east of here. I decided I wanted to see the Northwest. I'd always wanted to see the Northwest, and I didn't have much money, so I started out riding the freights. I rode a freight train from Tracy about 20 miles to Stockton, and there weren't any open boxcars. So like a fool, I just hung on a ladder like this, which was very dangerous. And I was so terrified by the time the train got to Stockton, I hitchhiked all the rest of the way to Seattle and back. Later, I took several other trips on freight trains. In the early 1970s, some other friends and I rode freights all the way to Chicago to go to the annual convention of the Industrial Workers of the World, or Wobblies, or IWW. The IWW is a radical syndicalist labor union which was founded back in 1905. The reason it was founded, mainly by Eugene Debs, Big Bill Haywood, and a radical Catholic priest named Father Haggerty, was because up until that time there had been only craft unions. And the industries were getting bigger and bigger and more centralized. And when they'd have a strike, often just one craft would go out and all the other workers would cross their picket lines. So the IWW developed the concept of industrial unionism, whereby all the workers in the factory or industry would be in one union. So when there was a strike, they would all go out together. They had much more economic power against the employers. So anyway, we rode freights all the way back to the convention, and then all the way back by way of the Northwest. It was a very exciting experience. Later, through my experiences in the IWW, I met an old-time wobbly named Joe Murphy. Oh, by the way, I should explain the meaning of that term, wobbly. Back in around 1910 or 11, there was an IWW strike up in British Columbia, and the workers would go to a Chinese cafe, and the owner of the cafe couldn't speak very good English, and he couldn't say IWW, so he said I wobbly wobbly. So the IWW members adopted that as a nickname. Anyway, in the early 70s, I met Joe Murphy, who had been an organizer in the old days for the IWW, and he told me all these fantastic stories of his adventures organizing all over the world. He was in many of the big strikes, free speech fights, and later, after Joe died in 1987, I wrote this book, a semi-fictional novel based on his experiences. It's called Break Their Haughty Power, which is a line from the song Solidarity Forever by Ralph Chaplin. And by the way, this beautiful color painting is by a painter named Liz Penniman, who lives up on Tomales Bay in Marshall. Joe grew up in Springfield, Missouri, a railroad town in southwest Missouri, and there was a lot of prejudice against Catholics there. His family were Catholic, and when Joe was 13 going on 14, he was taking his father's dinner to him at the rail yards one night, and he was attacked by these four youths. Often it was children of families who were in the KKK who would attack people, and especially Catholics. They were a minority there, and they threatened to kill Joe, and in desperation he pulled out his pocket knife, and apparently one of the other kids was pushed into it, and everybody ran off, and Joe was so afraid of being arrested that he hopped the first freight train going west to the wheat harvest in Kansas, and he fell in with some Wobblies. At that time they had what was called a 1,000-mile picket line. In order to keep strikebreakers out of the harvest area, the Wobblies would demand that everybody who rode the freights show an IWW membership card. And they were going to throw Joe off the freights, but he knew something about the IWW. He had an older brother, Emmett, who was a member, and he'd read quite a bit of the history. And so to keep from being thrown off the freights, Joe, who was very imaginative, told the other Wobblies that he was an illegitimate son of Big Bill Haywood, who was the most famous leader of the IWW. And so they let him stay on until he could earn some money and buy a membership card. And he worked all through the harvest, all the way up through Kansas and the Dakotas and into Canada. And in the fall of that year, he ended up in the Northwest in Washington State. He worked for a while in the woods. And on November 10th, he was in the big IWW hall in Seattle. And the next day was Armistice Day, November 11th. World War I had ended the year before on that day. And they suddenly got word in the hall that American Legionnaires had broken into an IWW hall in the town of Centralia, about 120 miles south. The Legionnaires and some of the hired hoodlums of the Lumber Trust had been busting up IWW halls all over the West, and the Wobblies hadn't fought back until now, but they got advice from their lawyer, Elmer Smith. They had the right to defend their hall. And there had been a big American Legion parade, and when they got to the IWW hall, they halted the parade, and they broke into the hall, and the Wobblies defended themselves this time. And one of the Wobblies there in the hall was Wesley Everest, who'd been in the war in Europe, and he was still in his army uniform. And as the Legionnaires broke into the hall, he shouted out, "I fought for democracy in France, and I'm going to fight for it here." So there was a big shootout, and 3 Legionnaires were killed, and later they chased Wesley Everest down to the Skookumchuck River, and they captured him there and dragged him back through town, beating him all along the way. In the meantime, Joe and about 100 other Wobblies had ridden the freight south from Seattle to try to help out their fellow workers there in Centralia. And by the time they got there, the town was like an armed camp, and they were immediately all arrested and thrown in jail. And they dragged Wesley Everest to the jail, and they threw his body down in the corridor in front of the cells where the Wobblies were. And about midnight that night, all the lights in town went out, and some big cars arrived in front of the jail, and they dragged Wesley Everest out and threw him in this car, and supposedly a local doctor castrated him, and they drove him down to the river and hung him from a railroad trestle and filled his body full of holes. Wesley Everest was one of the great Wobbly martyrs along with Joe Hill and Frank Little. And incidentally, today the IWW is still going, and we have another martyr, a semi-martyr today, Judy Berry, who's an IWW organizer who's been very active in Earth First, who was nearly killed in May of 1980 when her car was blown up by a bomb. Anyway, Joe continued on in the IWW. He became an organizer, and he was in many strikes. He was in jail about a month there in Centralia, and then later he got a job as a dishwasher in Seattle. And some waitresses went on strike there, and while the boss wasn't looking, Joe took all the dishes and hid them on the roof. The IWW was famous for innovative tactics like that. And the waitresses finally won that strike. Another thing the Wobblies did is that a lot of the Wobblies who weren't working at the time would go into this restaurant at noon hour and all order 1 cup of coffee and dawdle over this cup of coffee all during the noon hour to bring pressure against the employer. Joe Murphy also became a fundraiser for the IWW, and he traveled all over the country raising funds for political prisoners, IWW members who had long prison sentences, often simply for being a member of the IWW. Often they committed no crime whatsoever. And in California, back in the 20s, they had what was called the criminal syndicalism law. And under this law, simply for having an IWW membership card, you could be sentenced to prison for from 1 to 14 years. So Joe traveled around raising funds, and he was able to meet a lot of influential people. At one time, he was introduced to Charlie Chaplin in Hollywood, and he Chaplin took him around the studio, and a lot of directors and stars contributed. He raised a lot of money through the help of Charlie Chaplin. He sailed all over the world. When he was in England, he met Emma Goldman, and when his ship was in dry dock in Le Havre, France, he went to Paris and met Sylvia Beach, who owned Shakespeare and Company and who published Ulysses, and he met all these famous people in Paris, Ezra Pound and Anais Nin. Joe met some very distinguished people. He met Helen Keller in Chicago in the early 20s. Helen Keller was a member of the IWW for several years. In 1924, Joe chauffeured Eugene Debs all over California on Debs' last speaking tour for the Socialist Party. He drove Debs from San Francisco to Stockton, to Fresno, to Bakersfield, and finally to the Hollywood Bowl, where Debs was introduced by Upton Sinclair at a huge rally, and Debs gave one of his last great speeches, and he died a couple of years later back in Illinois. Joe was in the big waterfront strike in Portland in 1922, which was called the Portland Revolution, and he was in the big railroad strike in Colorado in 1927 and 28. That strike started as a response to the pending execution of Sacco and Vanzetti, the anarchists, Italian immigrants who were framed up on a murder charge in Massachusetts. And the Wobblies organized virtually all the coal miners in Colorado. Mother Jones had been there a few years before, organizing for the United Mine Workers, but by that time, 1927, there weren't many workers organized. The Wobblies organized virtually all of them. There were workers from all different ethnic groups. There were Greeks, Poles, Welshmen, blacks, Italians, and they had some very innovative tactics there. They had the first big car caravans were used during strikes. Hundreds of cars would take the workers from one coal field in eastern Colorado to the other. And a lot of these cars were loaned to them by local businessmen because the business owners depended on the workers for their livelihood, and when the workers got better pay, they did better too. And there also were some great women strike leaders in this strike. There was a 17-year-old woman they called Flaming Milka, and Joe Murphy sometimes spoke with her at different stops as they traveled throughout the coal fields. Several workers were killed during that strike by the militia or by the hired gunmen of the coal interests. Many of the mines were owned by the Rockefeller interests. But they finally won that strike after about 6 months, and it was a big victory. The last big strike Joe was in was the Boulder Dam strike in 1931. That was near Las Vegas, Nevada, and Joe was one of the strike leaders in that. And they did get some concessions, but they didn't have really great success in that strike. And the IWW had started going downhill by that time. In 1924, there was a big split between centralists and decentralists, and the IWW broke up into two different groups after that. And it never entirely disappeared, though. It still exists today. There are a few hundred members. They've set up some workers' co-ops, and they often give strike support in strikes of other unions, and they're still going. And the aim of the IWW is industrial democracy, that the workers should own the industries and run them democratically themselves in the interest of all the people of the world.
Now, I know that the IWW was very devoted to rank-and-file democracy. I'd like to know how you see the comparison between the IWW and the situation then with the situation with the unions today.
Well, most of the unions today are what are called business unions. They're bureaucratic, and unfortunately there isn't much participation by the members. But the IWW was a very militant revolutionary union, and the main thing about the IWW was that they believed in worker participation and worker democracy. They encouraged all the members to take part in meetings, to express their opinions, and it also was the first racially integrated union, the first union to admit women and blacks and other minority groups. And there was a lot of spirit. One thing that helped sustain IWW was that they did a lot of singing. There were a lot of great songs that they always sang at meetings, like Solidarity Forever, which was written by Ralph Chaplin, an IWW member, and there were all of Joe Hill's songs, and there was a lot of joyous spirit in the IWW. The Wobblies felt that that struggle should be a joyous thing. It shouldn't be a grim process, and that's one reason they had so much success. In the 1960s, I was living with my ex-wife and daughter in Berkeley, and I met a fellow named Henry Anderson who put out a monthly publication called Farm Labor to support the farm workers and the farm unions. At that time, there were two unions. The AFL-CIO had a union called the Agriculture Workers Organizing Committee, and Cesar Chavez had formed another union in the Delano area. Delano's about 130 miles north of Los Angeles at the north end of the San Joaquin Valley. And Henry Anderson encouraged me to go to Delano and work for the union. So finally in 1964 I went to Delano and I met Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta. And Cesar Chavez was planning to start a union newspaper then, and he asked me if I'd like to be the editor, but I was on my way to Mexico at the time. I was committed to compile a book of interviews with braceros and wetbacks, which are usually called undocumented immigrants now in the U.S. When I got back to California, I went to Delano and went to work for the union. In the meantime, Chavez had hired another fellow to start the newspaper, but I remember my first day in Delano. Dolores Huerta asked me as my first job to sweep the floor of the office, this ramshackle office in the slum area of Delano. And I did that, and I did all kinds of things. I worked part of the time as Cesar Chavez's secretary, and I went around and collected dues members, and at that time I was sleeping on the floor of the office, and my daughter, who was 7 years old at the time, stayed with Cesar Chavez's family. And about 3 weeks after I went to work for the union, in September 1965, this big strike started. It was the biggest farm worker strike in modern times in California, and we were striking about 33 vineyard owners in that area, and it was a very thrilling experience, the most thrilling experience of my life. I was the head of one of 4 groups of roving pickets we had the first few months of the strike, and we'd go from ranch to ranch getting the strike breakers out, and it was, there was a lot of danger involved. Sometimes the growers would shoot shotguns off over our heads, or try to run us down with their pickups, spray us with insecticides, and at one point, about a month after the strike started, a grower tried to strangle me on the picket line. He came close to it too, but his own security guard fortunately pulled him off of me. I managed to get him arrested, but of course they found him not guilty. At the end of 1965, we started an international boycott against the growers in that area and against Schenley products. The Schenley Liquor Corporation owned the second biggest vineyard in the Delano area, and they had a winery which produced custom like wine there. And so we sent people out all over the U.S. to organize the boycott, and I ended up in charge of the boycott in the state of Texas. We started setting up picket lines in front of supermarkets and grocery stores. And in March of 1966, the Schenley Corporation agreed to negotiate a contract, our first big breakthrough. And as a result, the boycott was called off temporarily. And a lot of people in Texas had been encouraging me to organize workers there, where they were much better off and much worse off than in California. And some the Chavez's union wasn't ready to move into Texas yet, so some associates and I formed an independent union, the Independent Workers Association in South Texas, in Starr County, down on the Rio Grande. And a big strike broke out there on June 1st of 1966. And later we had a big march, a farm worker march of 492 miles, all the way from Rio Grande City on the Rio Grande to Austin for a big Labor Day rally. And as a result of the march, San Antonio and another city passed minimum wage laws, And the Texas Rangers engaged in a lot of illegal strike activities, anti-strike activities, and we filed a suit against them, and that suit went back and forth through the courts for about 4 years. And finally we won it. The U.S. Supreme Court, William O. Douglas signed the majority opinion, and it threw out 5 Texas anti-labor laws and enjoined the Texas Rangers from engaging in illegal strike activities. Anyway, I worked with the farm workers for about 2 years, but my main interest had always been in writing, so finally in 1967 I returned to California and went back to my writing. I'd written several books by then. I'd been in a writer's colony in Illinois where James Jones wrote From Here to Eternity, and by that time I had married a Mexican-American nurse, and Lonnie Handy, this brilliant woman who ran the writer's colony, persuaded me to write a hospital novel because my wife could supply me with all this background information. So I wrote a hospital novel, but I was unable to sell it. And then I wrote a novel about braceros. Between 1943 and 1966, there was what was called the Bracero program, whereby Mexican workers could come up and work for a few months in the U.S. During World War II, some of them were railroad workers, but after the war, they were all farm workers. And so my daughter and I went to Mexico, and I did a lot of research for this novel, The Bracero, and that was published in 1973 by a small publisher in Berkeley, and later by a larger publisher called Peace Press in Los Angeles. Bracero was later published in Moscow in the former Soviet Union in 1979. I went over there to collect my royalties, and in 1981 it was published in Sweden, and I went over to Sweden to help promote the book there. Later I wrote a short book about my experiences riding boxcars, which I called the Overalls Brigade. This was about 2 trips which some other Wobblies and I took to Wobbly conventions, and we were reliving a famous episode in 1908 in IWW history in which a bunch of migrant workers rode the freights back to Chicago and had rallies along the way. Later I wrote a couple of novels about love affairs, and Cesar Chavez had introduced me to a fellow named Tony Arendine, who at one time was Secretary and Treasurer of his union. And Tony Arendine had spent the first 18 years of his life in Mexico, and then he started coming up as a wetback to work in the fields. And I interviewed him and edited this long interview, and it was published in 1975 by a publisher in Utah called Peregrine Smith, and later it was sold to the University of Notre Dame Press that still publishes that book. In 1992, I published a book of my own poems, which I called Poems Sane and Insane. As I said earlier, I started writing poems back in my high school days, and I decided I finally would publish my poems.
Now you're using a pseudonym.
Yes, I used this pseudonym Harijan, which in India means untouchable. Being poor much of my life, I've often felt I was untouchable. There are a lot of people who don't like to associate with poor people, at least in the United States. And I put through Harijan instead of by, because all my poetry, or almost all of it, has been written by inspiration, and I never studied the art of poetry writing, so a lot of it may be rather amateurish, but at least it's sincere. And often when these lines would spring into my mind, I had the feeling that I was just the conduit, that these lines of poetry were coming from some outside source, a universal soul, or some magical source.
Would you like to read a few?
Sure. First I'll read the brief prologue. A mind which has done more things, that is mine. No one would guess by looking at me, no one. The real dreams, the unreal realities, the insanities of perception, the pictures, and the music. Next I'll read a poem I wrote when I was 19. I wrote mainly love and nature poems in my first years of writing poetry, and this is called Rima. I had read the novel Green Mansions by W.H. Hudson, and the protagonist was called Rima, the bird girl. I wrote this in the Canton Cafe in Tracy. My best friend at that time was this Chinese-American kid, Hong, whose mother owned the Canton Cafe beside the railroad tracks in Tracy. I am coming to you silently through the trees, where each veined leaf is a page of memories that the many-visioned wind reads with moan reveries. As I go softly through the trees, I listen to the reveries. The shadows under the trees where the sun has planted them speak a delicate, brooding language, a dark mellifluence that stutters when the wind blows. What is the meaning of mellifluence, shade utters? The sun knows. Silent, enervating sun, if you are the only one who knows the meaning of the song, why have you come close as if to whisper, then left, and left the shadows long? Let's see. Some of these are rather risque. One reason I used the pseudonym is I didn't want to embarrass my daughter by some of these more risque poems. Let's see. This is a poem I wrote about my two Media Rasa daughters, The Color of Things to Come. I do not salute the old nationalist fantasies, dividers and destroyers, decadent separators. No, I salute the old wobbly lumber locals in Louisiana, half black and half white, working and living as brothers. I salute my daughters, half Aztec, half Anglo, living poems of a golden-skinned future. I am a melting flesh pot. I can love both fair and brown like lusty English minister Donne. I salute the great miscegenous, Dumas and his mulatto son, Baudelaire and his Negro mistress, Gauguin grooving in the Tahiti sun, Han Suyin and Pocahontas. I salute the sublime mathematics of 2 and 2 make 1. This is a poem about my daughter Tamar. She had just gone to Mexico on a trip with some friends while she was going to the University of California in Berkeley, and she brought me back this beautiful pair of huaraches, Mexican sandals. My daughter gave me some huaraches. She brought them back from Mexico. I like to smell them and hear the squeak of the leather. When I walk in them, I am walking with her. I like to wear them without socks, my feet showing through. It makes me feel real and one with the earth. I like to sit and look at them. So beautiful, the color. I like to walk in them and pretend I'm walking in Mexico. They make me think of Taxco, of Torreon, of old friends in little sun-kissed villages. But most of all, they make me think of her, of our friendship, our love.
What does your button say?
Well, this is an old button I got when I worked for the Farm Workers Union in Delano. It's a photograph of Emiliano Zapata, the great Mexican revolutionary leader. It says, "Viva la causa," long live the cause.
What is your opinion of the peasant uprising that's been happening in Chiapas, Mexico?
Well, I'm not surprised that something like that would happen. My daughter and I lived about 4.5 years in Mexico, and we saw some of the terrible conditions among the rural people there. Mexico is even more of a class society than the United States is. And I actually met a grower from Chiapas once at a resort near Manzanillo on the Pacific coast of Mexico, and to my amazement and horror, he actually spoke of the workers there as animals. I couldn't believe it. And later I traveled down to that part of Mexico, and conditions were even worse there than in most parts of Mexico. A lot of the farms are these huge plantations where the workers are paid practically nothing. And you may recall that the uprising in Chiapas began on New Year's Day, which was the day that the new NAFTA agreement took effect. And the people in the uprising said that's one reason they decided to start it that day, because the NAFTA agreement is going to allow huge corporations to take over more and more of the land of the small landowners and drive them into being wage slaves, and it's probably going to have a disastrous effect. So I wouldn't be surprised if there aren't more uprisings like this. 7 or 8 years ago, I started to get more active in the social movement again. I started working to try to help preserve rent control. I was living in Berkeley, and some members of the state legislature were trying to do away with rent control, which would make it very, very hard on lower income people. A lot of them would have to move out of their apartments, and in fact this has happened to a lot of people. They've become homeless people because of skyrocketing rents. And I went up to Sacramento several times through the years, usually with the Gray Panthers. They would charter buses, and a lot of people would go up there to lobby to try to preserve rent control, mainly elderly people. And it finally occurred to me that really there shouldn't be tenants, that the whole landlord system is a very bizarre thing when you stop to think about it. People really should all have their own homes, as they often did in so-called primitive societies. And so a few months ago, some associates and I decided to start an organization called Homes for All, with the idea of ultimately organizing worldwide and trying to completely do away with the slave landlord system and see that every person in the home had a home, a real home with lifetime security. Back at the end of World War II, the United Nations, in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, declared that it was a basic human right for everyone in the world to have a home. And yet there are more homeless people now than ever before, and the situation is getting worse and worse, and the landlord system is getting worse and worse. So what we are trying to do is organize towards an international rent strike and squat, in which people would stop paying rent in an effort to take over their own dwellings, and people who are totally homeless would squat in unused buildings and on unused land in an effort to get homes for everyone. We're not overly optimistic about having great success immediately with this and getting hundreds of thousands of people to stop paying rent, but I think it's important that people at least start thinking along these lines and start organizing to fight the landlord system. And I think as the landlord system gets worse and worse, we'll have more and more success in creating a massive international movement, and hopefully eventually all people will have the security of a home throughout their lives. The rent control situation has been deteriorating, unfortunately, in recent years. A few cities in California have had it: Berkeley, Santa Monica, West Hollywood. In some cities it's very watered down and not very effective, and the landlords and the real estate interests have been bringing more and more pressure to do away with it and to water it down. It's gotten worse for the tenants recently, and so there's more and more urgency about not only preserving rent control in the short run, but as I say, in organizing to see that everyone has a home. I realize that all governments don't have the resources to build homes for everyone, but at least it seems obvious to us that all people at least should have their share of the earth. The earth, like the air, is a natural resource that should be for everyone. And if people just had their share of the earth, they at least could pitch a tent, or they could build their own dwelling. Anyone with an IQ over 50 can build some sort of shelter, which is a lot better than being run off in the middle of the night by the police or by landlords or government bureaucrats and freezing to death out in the street or under some bridge someplace.
Now, why is the idea of housing as a basic human right such a subversive idea to the landlords?
Well, of course, it isn't subversive at all, but they like to make it seem subversive in their greed for profits. All my life, I've heard major politicians in the United States talk about the American dream of owning a home, and yet I've never seen a single one of these politicians do anything concrete to see that every citizen of the U.S. does own a home, or even a share of their land so they can build their own home. However, in the Bush administration, at least Jack Kemp, a right-wing Republican, surprisingly, was trying to help people in government housing get their apartments converted to ownership by the tenants. And so this shows that this issue really is an issue that transcends political parties and traditional political values. It's just it's obvious that everyone should have a home and his or her share of the earth. Just before Ronald Reagan became president, I read in the San Francisco Chronicle that slightly over 2/3 of the people in the United States owned a home. But a few months later, after Reagan was president, I read that over 1/3 of the people were homeless. So fewer and fewer people are able to build a home today. And yet, as I say, if people just owned a tiny bit of their share of the land, they could build something for themselves. There are people in Atlanta and Chicago. There's a group called the Mad Housers, and they are helping people build little one-room places for $200 or less. And in some places, they've been able to continue in these dwellings, but in other places, city officials have destroyed them or made them move off, even though they were occupying land which wasn't being used by anyone. We in Homes for All are trying to organize towards an international rent strike and squat, and we've tentatively chosen the date of May the 1st, 1995 for this to occur. And we're hoping that anyone who's interested in joining us will write to Homes for All. The address is Post Office Box 3615, Oakland, California, 94609. So please write to us, and we'll send you some information about our goals and the methods we have in mind, and we'd like to get input from as many people as possible. Another thing about Homes for All, if all people owned their own homes, why, it would go a long ways towards solving some of the other great problems of society. Like the problem of crime, for instance. It's throughout the years, statistics have shown that the crime rate is much, much lower among homeowners, which isn't surprising. When people have something good in this life, naturally they're less apt to jeopardize it by committing a crime. Also, the right-wingers are always complaining about welfare, and unfortunately, a lot of people on welfare pay as much as 60 or 70% of their meager income for housing, often in horrible places in the ghettos. They pay that kind of money to slum landlords, and it's not surprising that when children, kids growing up in the ghetto, look up at the hills and see these people living in mansions, and then they see their parents paying 60 or 70% of their meager income for some hovel. It's not surprising that they turn to drugs or a life of crime. How can they have much respect for society and its laws when they see these great class differences?